This is terrible. Do you even have eyes? Emily, the cleaning supervisor, shouted angrily at Kyle, the new janitor. Kyle glanced at the gleaming glass surfaces. I just cleaned it. Without hesitation, Emily grabbed a full cup of coffee and slammed it onto the table. The dark liquid splattered across the glass, dripping down the edges and onto the floor. She crossed her arms and stared at Kyle with a contemptuous look. Now clean it again. If you believe that all people, regardless of their skin color or position, deserve respect, like this video and comment where you're watching from. It was early morning. Scott Group, one of the largest real estate and investment firms, was just starting its workday. Its towering glass building gleamed among the city's skyscrapers. Employees in crisp suits, carrying expensive bags and overpriced coffees, walked through the hallways with pride, as if they belonged to an elite class in the business world. Amidst this, the roar of a heavy motorcycle shattered the morning silence. Kyle Scott stepped off the bike. He wore a simple hoodie, dark jeans, and carried an old backpack over his shoulder. From the outside, he looked like just another passerby. But what no one knew was that he was the true heir to this empire, the eldest son of Adam Scott, the billionaire founder of the company, a man who, after remarrying, had left the company in the hands of its executives. And now, according to rumors, minorities in the company were facing discrimination. Kyle was here to see the truth with his own eyes. As he entered the building, he immediately felt the employees' eyes on him. Some looked surprised, others skeptical. The two receptionists whispered to each other. But the person who caught Kyle's attention the most was Daniel James. Daniel was one of the senior executives. A tall man with perfectly groomed hair and a suit that exuded power and arrogance. More than anyone, he upheld the Scott Group's standards. And in his mind, that meant the right kind of people in the right positions. And Kyle Scott, with his casual clothes and appearance, was not the right kind of person in Daniel's eyes. When Kyle reached the glass entrance doors, Daniel took a step forward with a condescending smirk and said, "Hey man, deliveries go through the back entrance. Have you ever walked into a place and before even saying a word, people assumed you didn't belong? If so, share your experience in the comments." Kyle could have revealed the truth right then and there. He could have wiped the smirk off Daniel's face in an instant. But no, it wasn't time yet. He gave a calm smile, adjusted his backpack strap, and said, "No, I'm not here for a delivery. I'm just looking for a job, sir." Daniel raised an eyebrow as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. He looked Kyle up and down, then let out a mocking chuckle. "A job?" he repeated with amusement. "You want to work here?" Kyle nodded. "Yes, I'm looking for an opportunity. If you've ever been unfairly judged, like this video and share your thoughts in the comments." But what no one knew was that this was just the beginning of the game. "Well, I don't think we're looking for new employees," Daniel James said dismissively as he walked past Kyle, acting as if the conversation was over. "Are you sure?" Kyle asked. "I'll take any job, any available position." At this point, Daniel was already losing patience. With a loud, exaggerated sigh, he gestured toward one of the receptionists at the front desk. "Hey, check the system. See if there's anything available for him." The receptionist, barely hiding her smirk, began typing on the computer. After a few moments, she looked up and grinned. "Well, we do have an opening." She turned to Daniel. Daniel smirked. "Really? What position?" The receptionist chuckled mockingly. "The cleaning team is hiring." A brief silence filled the space, thick with unspoken amusement. Daniel turned back to Kyle, his smirk widening. "So what do you say? You were looking for an opportunity, weren't you?" Kyle tilted his head slightly, as if considering. He could feel the weight of the moment, the stares, the hidden laughter, and the assumption that he was desperate. At that moment, he made his decision. With a slow nod, he smiled and said, "All right, I'll take it." Daniel blinked in surprise. "What?" Kyle repeated calmly. "I said, I'll take it." Daniel started laughing. The other employees watching the scene shook their heads, shocked that this man had actually accepted a janitorial job. But Kyle didn't move. He just smiled, because they had no idea what mistake they had just made. They had just given Kyle Scott, the future heir of Scott Group, the perfect opportunity to witness firsthand the depth of discrimination within the company. They had no clue who they were talking to. And very soon they were about to find out. Because now things were about to get interesting. Did you think getting a new job would make things better? For Kyle Scott, The real test was only just beginning. Imagine walking into a place where everyone sees you as beneath them, where every word, every glance, and even every breath is a reminder that you don't belong. Have you ever been treated unfairly at work just because of who you are? If so, prepare yourself, because what's coming next might make your blood boil. And if you're invested in this story, hit the like and subscribe buttons, because you won't believe what happens next. And now here he was, Kyle Scott, the hidden heir of Scott Group, wearing a janitor's uniform, holding a mop and a bucket of water. Less than an hour into the bomb, and it was already clear he was not welcome here. The company floors gleamed under the most luxurious lights, floors polished by generations of workers who had walked these hallways. But none of those workers, none of them, had ever been a secret CEO. And yet, no one in this building saw Kyle as anything more than a janitor. No one made that clearer than his new supervisor. Her name was Emily Whitmore, tall, blonde, and with a permanent scowl. Emily had worked at Scott Group for years, and she took pride in her position. Too much pride, because in her mind, she had power over those beneath her. And from the moment she saw Kyle, she made it clear that she viewed him as the lowest of the low. It started right away. "Hey, you!" Emily's sharp voice echoed down the hallway. Kyle, with a rag in his hand, turned to see her marching toward him with a hard glare. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Kyle glanced at the rag and then back at her. "Mopping," Emily scoffed. "Don't play smart with me. I don't like people like you thinking they can act tough here." "People like me?" Kyle smiled, curious to see just how far this disrespect would go. And he quickly realized it went deep. Emily didn't just dislike Kyle. She resented him. And at every opportunity, she made sure he knew it. If he cleaned a hallway, not good enough. If he wiped down a table, it had streaks. If he emptied a trash can, too slow. No matter what Kyle did, Emily Whitmore always found something to complain about. But she didn't just correct him. She humiliated him in front of everyone. One afternoon, while Kyle Carter was cleaning the executive lounge, Emily snapped at him. "Are you stupid?" Kyle, as calm as ever, set his cloth down. "Did I do something wrong?" Emily widened her eyes mockingly, then turned to a few nearby employees who had already been watching. "Did he do something wrong?" she sneered. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the fact that you're still standing here like a 5-year-old after cleaning?" The employees chuckled under their breaths. Kyle scanned their faces. He didn't react, didn't flinch, because the same people laughing at him now would soon regret every second of it. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, Daniel James entered the picture. Yes, Daniel James, the same racist manager who had mocked him on his first day. The same man who still had no idea that the person he looked down on was about to own his entire future. Daniel walked into the hallway just as Kyle was kneeling to clean the floor. "Well, well, well." Kyle didn't need to turn around to feel Daniel's smirk. "Look at you," Daniel mocked him, crossing his arms. "Looks like we found the perfect place for you, huh?" Kyle sighed. "Not yet. Not yet." He still hadn't revealed himself. This was going to be so much more fun. Daniel decided to make Kyle's life hell. He walked through the hallways, dropping trash on the floor right after Kyle cleaned it. He spilled coffee on purpose and demanded that Kyle wipe it up. Every chance he got, he called him boy. And the worst part? He did it in front of everyone. Some laughed, some stayed silent, and a few people watched Kyle closely. Because something about him was different. The way he stood, his overwhelming confidence, his presence, so calm and controlled, and the way he looked at people, like he was studying them. But still, the harassment continued, until the day Emily Whitmore, the same cruel supervisor, took things too far. Kyle had just finished cleaning the executive conference room when Emily walked in. "What is this?" she snapped, pointing at the freshly wiped table. Kyle blinked. "A table?" Emily let out a loud, exaggerated laugh. "It's dirty. Are you blind?" Kyle glanced at the shiny, spotless glass. "I just cleaned it." Emily smirked. "You missed a spot." Then, without hesitation, she picked up a full cup of coffee and threw it across the table. The dark liquid splattered across the glass, dripped over the edges, and spilled onto the floor. Emily crossed her arms and stared at Kyle. "Now clean it again." Silence. The room went dead quiet. Every employee walking past the room suddenly stopped. Their eyes widened in shock. Kyle took a slow breath and smiled. Now the real show was about to begin. Because what Emily and Daniel didn't know was that their entire world was about to collapse. Kyle Carter had been playing the long game. They had mocked him, humiliated him, treated him like he was beneath them. They thought he was just a janitor. They thought he was nothing. But what they didn't know was that he was about to become their new boss. And when Kyle's father, Adam Scott, the billionaire CEO and owner of the company, finally walked in, every assumption, every judgment, every ounce of arrogance in that building would be shattered. Meanwhile, the receptionist's phone rang sharply. She answered, her voice professional, until after a few moments, her face changed, first to shock, then to fear. Because on the other end of the line was Adam Scott, and he was on his way to the company. The news spread like wildfire. Executives straightened their ties. Receptionists scrambled to organize documents. Employees whispered nervously, "The big boss is coming." But no one was more excited than Daniel James, because he still believed he was in control. For a brief moment, he thought he could handle everything. But Daniel was about to learn that he controlled absolutely nothing. The golden opportunity arrived. In Daniel James's mind, this was his moment. A golden opportunity to impress the boss. He could see it so clearly, shaking hands with Adam Scott, discussing company growth, maybe even securing a promotion. And the janitor, Daniel had completely forgotten about Kyle. To him, Kyle was nothing more than a background character in his perfectly structured world. But Daniel was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Then it happened. The elevator doors dinged open, and the entire room fell silent. Adam Scott walked in, a tall man, dressed in an elegant white suit, his face marked by authority. His presence alone demanded respect. Behind him, his assistants, security, and senior executives entered with precision and coordination. And the moment he stepped inside, every single person in the room stood a little straighter. Daniel puffed out his chest. Emily Whitmore, the racist supervisor, adjusted her blouse, already imagining herself catching the CEO's attention. Employees whispered excitedly. This was the man everyone had been waiting for. Adam reached the center of the room, turned slowly and smiled. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adam's voice was smooth and strong. "Today is a special day for this company." Everyone held their breath. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his fists clenched in anticipation, his eyes shining with excitement. Adam continued, "For years I have built Scott Group with the hope of leaving behind a legacy, a company that stands for greatness, success, and most importantly," he paused for a moment, scanning the room, "integrity." A few people shifted uncomfortably at that word. Then Adam smiled again. "And today I am proud to announce that my firstborn son has officially entered the building." Silence. A wave of confusion rippled through the room. His firstborn son? People glanced at each other. His son? The new CEO? Daniel's heart pounded. He had never seen Adam's son before. No one had. The whispers started. "Wait, has anyone ever seen his son? I thought he had a younger boy from his second wife. Who is it?" Daniel's mind raced. If Adam's son was the new CEO, then he had to be here already. But where? His eyes scanned the room. Then his mind clicked. Yes. The only possible explanation was that it had to be one of the senior executives. Maybe one of the young white men standing in tailored suits at the back of the room. Maybe that well-dressed guy from finance? Daniel smirked. This was perfect. A wealthy white man as the new CEO? That was how it was supposed to be. Beside him, Emily nodded in silent agreement. They had nothing to worry about. But then Adam spoke again, and this time, his words shook the entire room. "My son is right here," Adam said proudly. "Kyle, come here." Time stopped. Every pair of eyes snapped around. Daniel's head jerked to the side. Emily's confident smile froze, because there he was, standing right where they had left him, still in his janitor's uniform, still holding his mop and bucket. Kyle. Complete silence. Then Daniel's face drained of color. Emily gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. Employees murmured in shock. Because the man they had ignored, the man they had mocked, the man they had treated like garbage, was now their new CEO. And in that moment, Daniel realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Right there in that office, in front of every single employee, Daniel James and Emily Whitmore were about to face the consequences of their actions. For days, weeks, months, they had laughed at Kyle Carter, looked down on him, treated him as less than human. Never, not even in their wildest dreams, did they imagine that the man they had humiliated was the man who now controlled their future. But now the truth stood right in front of them. Just a moment, only a moment. No one moved, no one breathed. The air in the office was so thick with tension that you could hear the pounding of hearts. Daniel, standing near the center of the room, stared at Kyle in shock. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Emily, just a few steps away, felt her stomach drop. Her face turned pale. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Because nothing made sense. It couldn't make sense. Kyle? The janitor? No, this wasn't possible. They had spent days belittling this man. They had made him clean their trash. They had spilled drinks just to force him to mop them up again. Emily had even poured her coffee onto a table just to watch him clean it, right in front of everyone. And now they were being told that this same man was the CEO of Scott Group. No, this had to be a joke, a cruel, twisted joke, but it wasn't. Kyle took a step forward. His posture was upright, strong. His face was calm, unreadable. But his eyes, oh, his eyes were sharp, focused, because today he wasn't playing anymore. He glanced around the room, watching as whispers spread like wildfire. Is this real? He's really the new CEO? But, but he was the janitor this whole time. Kyle's gaze swept over them, memorizing their faces in silence. Then finally, he spoke. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. His voice was smooth, firm, and full of authority. The room fell into a dead silence. Daniel stood frozen in place, barely blinking. His mind scrambled to find something, anything to say. Emily, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to disappear. Kyle let the silence linger. Then he turned to his father, who stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. His father gave him a slow, approving nod. Kyle nodded back. And just like that, the room belonged to him. My name is Kyle Carter Tinsley. His voice echoed through the office, drawing every single eye to him. I am the firstborn son of Adam Scott, and as of today, I am the new CEO of Scott Group. Boom, just like that. The truth was out, and now nothing could stop him. Daniel's body went stiff. Emily let out a quiet, strangled gasp. Employees exchanged stunned glances. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone sucked in a sharp breath, as if struggling to believe what they had just heard. Kyle stood still, no emotion, no hesitation, because for the first time since stepping into this office, everyone finally saw him for who he really was. I've spent the past few days working in this building as a janitor. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the room. I wanted to see how this company, my company, treats the people they think no one is watching. Then his eyes locked onto Daniel. Daniel swallowed hard. And what I saw, Kyle continued, lowering his voice slightly, was not just disappointing, it was disgusting. Daniel started shaking. His breath came faster. Kyle took a slow, deliberate step toward him. You thought I was a nobody. His voice was calm, deadly. You mocked me. You laughed in my face. And you did it with full confidence because you believed no one could ever hold you accountable. Daniel's hand trembled. He tried to speak, tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. But before he could utter a word, Kyle raised a hand. Daniel's mouth snapped shut. Then Kyle turned his head. His gaze landed on Emily. Emily's face flushed red. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, for something to save her. But she found nothing. Kyle tilted his head slightly. And you. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Emily remembered. You poured your coffee onto a table and made me clean it. Her eyes squeezed shut. Kyle let the weight of his words sink in. Then finally, he spoke his last words. Now, he said, his voice steady, let me ask you one question. The room held its breath. If you had known who I was from the start, Would you have treated me the same way? Silence. A long, painful silence. Then Emily slowly shook her head. Her voice was small, ashamed. No, Kyle smiled, because now the power was in his hands. For a moment, just one short, terrifying moment, Daniel thought, hoped, that maybe this was all a dream, a nightmare, because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He had spent days humiliating Kyle Carter Tinsley, treating him like nothing. And now, standing before him, still wearing that same janitor's uniform they had mocked him in, was a man who could end his entire career without a single word. Kyle slowly scanned the room. His eyes met each employee's face, committing them to memory. Some had stood by and watched. Some had laughed along with the others. But a few had been kind. And that he would not forget. Because Kyle had seen everything. Then his gaze locked onto Daniel. And after what felt like time itself had frozen, Kyle finally spoke. Daniel James. The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Daniel flinched, his hands clenched at his sides. His body went rigid with fear, because he knew. He knew what was coming, but even still, he had to try. Mr. James, Daniel forced a weak smile. I didn't know. Kyle raised a hand. Daniel's mouth snapped shut. Because power? You know the moment you lose it. Kyle took a step forward. Let me ask you something, Daniel. His voice was calm, cold, deadly. Daniel swallowed, hard. Kyle tilted his head slightly. If you had known who I was, would you have treated me the same way? Daniel stood there, his mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But he had no answer, because they both knew the truth. Daniel dropped his gaze. I didn't know. His voice barely made it out. Kyle smiled. I know. His words were simple. That's exactly what I wanted. Because Daniel hadn't been cruel because of a bad day. He hadn't disrespected Kyle because of pressure or stress. No, Daniel had humiliated Kyle because he believed he was beneath him. And that was something Kyle would never forget or forgive. Then Kyle's gaze shifted to Emily. She stood frozen. Her hands clutched the fabric of her skirt as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. And now her terrified eyes were locked onto him. Emily tried to smile. Mister, I was just following company policy. She blurted out quickly. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Company policy? Emily nodded frantically. Yes, I was just... Kyle cut her off. Was pouring coffee onto a table company policy? Emily's face turned paper white. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Because there was no excuse. Kyle let the moment settle, let the weight of their actions crush them. Then he turned to his father. Adam Scott had been watching the entire thing, silent, his expression unreadable. And for the first time in his entire career, Adam Scott felt ashamed. Ashamed of what his company had become. Ashamed of the employees he had trusted. Ashamed that his own son had been humiliated by the very people who were supposed to represent his business. And now it was time to make things right. Adam stepped forward. His gaze moved from Daniel to Emily, then to Kyle. Finally, he sighed. Kyle, Adam said quietly, what do you think should be done? Daniel was visibly shaking. Emily's hands were clasped so tightly together, as if praying for a miracle. But Kyle didn't hesitate. Fire them, Adam nodded. Daniel James. His voice was calm but final. Your employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. No, his voice was hoarse. No, please. Adam didn't acknowledge him. He turned to Emily. Emily, your position as supervisor is revoked. You are no longer employed here. Emily let out a silent scream. Her wide, desperate eyes darted to Kyle. Her lips trembled. Mister, please, Kyle raised a hand. Emily's words died in her throat. And just like that, it was over. For days, Daniel and Emily had humiliated a man they believed was beneath them. And now, they were the ones who had nothing. But Kyle was far from finished. He turned back to the employees and then smiled. You all didn't stay silent, he said. And in that moment, One of the employees stepped forward. It was Sophia, the only one who had supported Kyle when no one else did. And now it was time for her to be rewarded. Kyle turned back to his father. My first decision as CEO, he said, is to promote Sophia, effective immediately. Shock, astonishment. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and at that very moment, the balance in the room shifted. For days, Kyle Scott had watched it all unfold. He had watched how they treated him, how they laughed at him, how they trampled on his dignity, all while thinking he was worth nothing. And now the truth had been revealed. Daniel James fired, Emily Stone ashamed and disgraced, and the rest of the employees, they were about to hear the most important words of their lives. Because this wasn't just the victory of one person. This was a fundamental shift in a system that had allowed discrimination to exist in the first place. A heavy silence filled the room. The same employees who had once laughed at Kyle, whispered about him, and treated him like he was invisible, now couldn't even look him in the eye. Kyle, still in his janitor's uniform, but now with a powerful and undeniable presence, stood there. No one questioned who he was anymore, because today, he was their leader. Kyle took a step forward, then another. The weight of this moment pressed down on the entire room. He looked carefully at each of their faces, and finally he spoke. Respect. One word, but it thundered in the air. He let it hang for a few seconds, allowing them to feel it. Then he continued. Respect is not something that should only be reserved for certain people. It should not be determined by race, class, clothing, or the way someone speaks. Respect should be the foundation of everything we do, because without it, we become exactly what we saw this week. A few people lowered their heads. Guilt and regret were beginning to form. I've walked these halls. I've been invisible to you. I've been disrespected and mocked. He glanced at the conference table, the same place Emily had thrown the coffee cup. I've had to clean up the messes that were created solely to humiliate me. The weight of his words was pressing down on their shoulders. He saw it. He felt it. But it wasn't over yet. And through all of this, I've learned one thing. He paused. Anyone who degrades others does so out of fear. Kyle nodded in agreement. Fear of change, fear of equality, fear of a world where power isn't based on privilege, but on merit and integrity. The room grew tense as he spoke the truth. And everyone in that room knew it. This ends today. Complete silence. Because this wasn't just a speech. This was a promise. Kyle looked at his father, the man who had built this company from the ground up, the man who had trusted others to run it, and the man who had just realized some of those people had led his company to the brink of destruction. Adam Scott shook his head. He wasn't just looking at his son, he was looking at the future. From this moment forward, Kyle announced, this company will implement new policies to ensure that discrimination has no place in our offices. Shock. A few people took deep breaths, but no one disagreed because really, what could they say? This time, there will be accountability. There will be consequences. There will be change. Then he did something no one expected. He smiled. Because this moment, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about building something better. This company will no longer be built on pride and arrogance. It will be built on respect, fairness, and the belief that when we lift each other up, we all grow. And in that very moment, everything changed. Because in that moment, the employees not only accepted Kyle as their new CEO, but they also recognized him as their leader. And for the first time, they truly understood. The company was finally in the right hands. Kyle looked at his father. Adam Scott took a deep breath, pride evident on his face. Then he did something he had never done before. He stepped forward and shook his son's hand. It was a formal gesture, a public acknowledgement, and an unspoken truth. This company now belonged to Kyle Scott. And now it was time to rewrite history. This is how you change the world, not with revenge, not with anger, but with power, true power. The kind of power that doesn't just break corrupt systems, but builds something better. What do you think? Do you think Kyle made the right decision? Should he have been kinder, or did he act justly? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Until next time, goodbye.